Thank you for doing some work on Bach, which is such a vast topic and in many ways kind of mysterious and challenging in trying to understand how to play this music, how to interpret. It's labor intensive, you have to figure out harmony, you have to figure out counterpoint, you have to figure out style and so on. So, but in the end, it's incredibly satisfying. This is something that I've thought about, the topic that I chose, which is the title is there expression in Bach? And we sometimes think that we shouldn't romanticize Bach because it's kind of serious music and it's sacred and all this kind of thing. So uh, getting emotional in Bach, it's a little bit dangerous. And it can be going in the wrong direction. Let's say playing it in a romantic way, with a lot of rubato or maybe quite a bit of pedal. So I've thought about this issue, and I've even asked some scholars about, is there emotion or expression in Bach? And the answer was always, of course, but it's of a certain kind. It's not romantic. It's kind of ideal in a way, and it's based in his faith also. So when there's something that's extremely dark and painful, it's often about the death of Christ. Sometimes it's joyous, sometimes it's very pastoral. So we kind of have to decide what level of expression to put into it. And I have something that I call it Baroque legato, which is the notes are connected and they're very melodic, but they're not as liquid as they would be, let's say, in Chopin or Liszt. It's just a different quality, maybe a little bit more separation of the articulation. So when I play something like I add a little bit of extra touch on each note so that it might be, a harpsichord kind of touch, uh, but it's still legato and it's still beautifully expressive.
Do you try to imitate harpsichord sound because he obviously didn't have the modern piano that we have. Legato and the touch and dynamic level is completely different. How do you make that connection, the period instrument and the Baroque style with the modern piano that we have?
Right. It's a very good question. And, he actually tried a forte piano late in life. His son was, already a classical composer. And he was intrigued by it, by the whole idea of being able to do crescendo and dynamics and that kind of thing. But he said, this is a very interesting instrument, but it's too late for me, he said. But of course, he was one of the great organ players of all time, maybe the most famous organ player in Europe. And he had basically three different kinds of instrument. He had the clavichord, which was at home. It's a very intimate instrument. And of course, he had many kinds of harpsichords. And then, of course, he had the organ. So I think one way to think about is what kind of instrument was this particular piece meant for? If you do something like the first prelude in Book Two, I won't play much, but I mean, with that long pedal point, that's got to be an organ piece. So in a way, that should influence the kind of sound that we try to get, which is very rich and very grand and majestic. Um, Other pieces are very intimate, maybe. Sorry. That probably, I would think that it's a clavichord piece because it's very soft and very kind of sounding kind of distant. So sometimes I think about the kind of instrument I want to bring out, and that influences my touch. I mean, you can't sound like a harpsichord, and it's okay, as far as I'm concerned, to use a little bit of pedal. We have this instrument, it can help with connecting certain things, but you have to be careful not to overdo the pedal. Some people play without pedal because obviously Bach didn't have a pedal. He had a organ pedal, it's a different kind of thing. But I think we can use the resources of the piano, certainly use dynamics. Even if you think about a harpsichord, sometimes there are like two keyboards, or they have different kind of registration, so you could change the dynamics in different sections, like what they call those terrace dynamics and that kind of thing. So you can't imitate, but you can kind of try to think about what kind of sound he had in mind, and that really makes a difference in how we actually touch the piano.
Now, Bach, as you mentioned, is a deeply spiritual person. Not everybody share, obviously, that spiritual faith. And but how would you help someone like a student to understand his music deeply and the sense of a spirituality?
That's a very good question. It's a tough one if you don't have a Christian faith, for example. If you don't are not totally familiar with, let's say, the Christian story. Uh, and it's hard because you can't express it as, let's say, you need to feel pain here, because it's not personal pain. It's more like some kind of the suffering of Christ. So in a way, we have to avoid being overly personal in expressing Bach, but still the emotion is there. But in a way, it's on a kind of on a more elevated level. And I think people can understand that even if they're not Christians, um, to understand the idea of suffering, the idea of sacrifice, and also coming back to life. They can be kind of universal themes that I think people can understand. But I think in order to play Bach, you do need to understand his Protestant faith, because it was very profound. So, in some ways, you have to take that step yourself.
You mentioned a couple of times not overly personal. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, something personal is how I feel. I'm hurt, I'm happy. It's something that's about myself or about people in general. And Bach's feeling is more not so much about I'm in pain, but there is pain out there. And it's a different kind of thing. I mean, even with Mozart in the operas, there's personal suffering. For example, was it? It's from the Magic Flute, and it's Pamina singing about losing her love of Tamino, and she says, "Ach, ich fühl's." She says, I feel that pain and the loss," and that's personal, and it's already, I would say, maybe kind of taking a step towards romanticism. But with Bach, I think you have to avoid that feeling of I'm suffering, uh, I'm in pain. It's more about something. It's a little bit more platonic in a way, or more ideal. And I think maybe composers like Beethoven and Mozart and Mendelssohn, they sensed that purity in Bach and they were inspired by it. Especially, I think in Beethoven's late works, there's a sense of kind of emulating that kind of elevated emotion that they found in Bach.